All right, well, welcome everybody to tonight's event, which is on Egypt and the power of people. We are thrilled to be joined today by two observers, keen observers of what has happened in Egypt. I'm joined by Mika Sifri, who's the co-founder and editor of the Personal Democracy Forum, a website and annual conference that covers the ways that technology is changing politics, and techpresident.com, which is an award-winning group blog on how the American presidential candidates were using the web and how the web is using them. He consults on how political organizations and campaigns, nonprofits, and media entities can adapt to and thrive in a networked world. And he's currently working on a book about WikiLeaks, which I think played an important role in what we were seeing in Tunisia and then Egypt. And I'm joined also by our colleague here at the Kennedy School, an adjunct lecturer of public policy, David Sanger, who is the chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times. He's been at the Times for 28 years, so that means he started when he was 5. He's been a member of 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning teams and has received numerous awards for national security, foreign policy, and White House reporting. He specializes in the coverage of nuclear proliferation and international economics and is the author of the bestseller, The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Power. He is a 1982 graduate of the college and precisely the kind of person I wanted to be before fate dealt me a cruel blow and made me a chubby professor instead of a hard-nosed Washington journalist. So we're going to talk about Egypt today. And I'm sure you've all been watching what has been happening there with great interest. As you know, we are now in the 6th day of the post-Mubarak era. The air is sweeter, the sun is brighter as a result. But things are still quite uncertain in Egypt. We know now that the military has taken over. They've suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament, which are things actually that the Egyptian opposition wanted. And they're promising now to midwife a democratic process. They're promising to amend the Constitution, to make it easier for political parties to participate in the political process. And they are promising to hold elections for the presidency within 6 months. So it is a time of hopefulness for lots in the Egyptian opposition, but many are beginning to be fearful. They're fearful that this military, like many other militaries before it and in other places, is not going to actually hand over the reins of power, that they have far too much of a vested interest in maintaining control of Egypt. So that's sort of where Egypt might be going, and it's certainly an important topic. But what we want to talk about today, first of all, is how we got to this extraordinary position where we're even thinking about what a post-Mubarak Egypt is going to look like. And I wanted to start with Mika because the role of technology has been really quite essential here. And if you listen to some of the folks in Egypt who talk about the role of Facebook and Twitter, it's very difficult to conclude, or it's very easy rather to conclude, that the father of Egyptian democracy is a young Harvard graduate named Mark Zuckerberg. Would you agree with that?
No. That was an easy one. First of all, technology, connection technology, is a very new phenomenon, and we're all beginning to understand how it may be changing the contours of politics and organizing in both democratic and authoritarian contexts. And I think it's the subject that we should spend a lot of time on, and that everyone is still trying to puzzle through to what degree this is like a new wild card. But I absolutely want to de-emphasize the Facebook role and maybe raise up things like the degree to which people are connected through mobile phones. I mean, internet penetration in Egypt is only about 20%. Mobile penetration is double that. And something like half of Egyptians who have mobile phones are using them to go online. And that is a number that has jumped enormously in just the last 5-6 years. So I'm not sure that we should really emphasize a specific social networking platform as much as all the tools. And then furthermore, if I had to pinpoint a factor, I would more call this either a blogger revolution or a networked revolution, to the degree that the new players, many of them started as bloggers, and frankly, Facebook is just blogging in a highly structured way. You know, it saves you the trouble of having to set up your own site and all of that. But you know, the bloggers who started in 2004, 2005 with something called the Kafia movement, which was sort of a unified front that just wanted to say enough. You know, no more Mubarak, no more to his son continuing after him. And you know, the fact that they could create their own media and route around the state-controlled media, that seems to me to be the most important thing, and the degree to which they could continue to do what they were doing even by putting their sites hosted outside of Egypt. These are really all very, very important factors. But they're just pieces of a larger puzzle, right? I mean, I'm not an expert on Egypt. But my read on this is we have to also pay attention to the role of labor and the amount of independent labor organizing that's been going on, the number of strikes that have been rising. One of the two major Facebook movements, if you will, this April 6th movement, was built around solidarity for workers, right? The other one was built around opposing torture. So it's a conjunction of things, but I don't think, frankly, we've heard enough about the role of labor and the strikes that were happening all over the country in the last few weeks. I'm not sure that the youth alone and the sort of bloggerati, whatever you want to call them, Whale-gonium, et cetera, could have pulled this off if they didn't also have support from workers, if they weren't also emphasizing things like raising the minimum wage. Right. You know, their demands were, one of their core demands actually was the raising the wages. So I think it's a whole bunch of things. And you know, so with all due respect to your most famous alumnus, by the way, and
I think we've got more famous alumni than him.
Yeah, well, he's the youngest famous alumnus, shall we put it that way? Facebook also, I think it's you know, we could talk about this a bit more if you want, but it's a double-edged sword for Facebook. Facebook has not quite clarified whether it wants to be seen as a platform for potential revolution. Right. At a critical moment last fall, one of the administrators of one of these key Facebook groups was kicked off because he was using a pseudonym, and Facebook's rules say you have to use a real name. Right. And human rights activists had been warning people, like in Syria, for example, where they just turned Facebook back on, you know, don't use it. It may be a trap. It's a very efficient way to help people figure out, if you're the police force, who to go arrest. Right, right. And given that Zuckerberg was just recently in China, where Facebook would like to expand, I would think that if I'm Facebook, I don't really want to be seen as something that disruptive, because certainly the Chinese don't want that.
Right. So David, you know, I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about other revolutions and things that you've covered, right? The People Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1986. There wasn't any kind of Facebook. Was there an analog of it, or a...
You know, Philippines is a fascinating example because the telephone system, the wired telephone system, was scratchy at best, and cell phones were not widespread. And same thing, remarkably, in South Korea, where now the cell phone penetration and the web penetration is among the highest in the world, but at the time was just sort of edging there. And I think that that gets to a point that Mika made, which is these tools are enormously helpful in organizing and in speeding up the process. And I think one of the really interesting questions is, would this have only taken 18 days absent the technologies that we were just discussing? Whereas the Philippines took significantly longer to get Marcos out. South Korea was a very long, gradual process, and one that the White House has been studying with great care in recent times because it's a process they'd be interested in replicating because it moves step by step, avoiding what Hillary Clinton referred to the other day as the concern about having these movements hijacked. So there are important lessons here from the non-electronic revolutions. And Mika raised another interesting element, which is there were core demands out here, which the government in Egypt always seemed to be a day late and a dollar short on. And they did in the days just before the fall of Mubarak. They announced a pay raise for all of the government workers in Egypt. If you did the back of the envelope math, and don't hold me to this because we are having a hard time figuring out exactly how many government workers there are and what to use as an average pay, it looks like that raise would probably amount to more than what the U.S. military assistance is on an annual basis. At some point, one of two things is going to happen in the next few months. Either the military is going to say, and you've already heard a little bit of this, hey, we got Mubarak out, cool it on the individual demands right now because it's more than the system can bear. Or you are going to see a division in the political world as people try to position themselves to take advantage of this huge vacuum. And it was a vacuum because you had Mubarak on the one side, the Muslim Brotherhood as a small but organized opposition group, and nothing in the middle that allowed for a real political formation to take place. As that political formation happens, you're going to see a lot of people who are naturally going to gravitate to some extraordinarily populist, probably uneconomically wise promises that they may or may not be able to keep.
Yeah, I think that's, and that kind of gets back to what Mika was talking about, which is that, for the longest time we've thought that there really wasn't any left anymore in Arab politics. That really if you were going to see a kind of mass movement, it would be Islamic in nature. And what we saw here is that, in fact, lots of the folks who are at the forefront of this movement, that using internet and using all of these tools, they happen to be, people of the left.
And don't tell Glenn Beck that.
Yeah. Well, maybe Glenn Beck will be happy to learn that it's not all Islamists. I mean, if he has to choose between the caliphate and Marx, maybe he'll, find his inner Marxist. I don't know. But the question is, what do you think other authoritarians have learned from what they saw in Egypt? We now see that things are starting to bubble up in Bahrain. We see things in Algeria and in Yemen. Do you think they've learned any lessons from this, and that they know how to thwart this, or is this not a stoppable force?
It's given that 6 months ago the experts were telling us that something like this couldn't happen, and that the young people were apolitical, they were apathetic, they were disorganized. I mean, I went back and reread a great magazine, New York Times Magazine story by Samantha Shapiro from, I think, about a year ago, that was called Egypt's Facebook Revolution. And she profiled a lot of the same people who are now in the headlines and described how there was infighting and how, they didn't have a good strategy. So there were all kinds of the sensitive observers could see that there was something new developing here among young people who were connected and politically inclined to do something outside the party framework. And there were all kinds of reasons why they weren't succeeding. Okay? And it may be that, as David, in that story he had, 2 days ago in the Times, that a core group really did get some serious training and sort of plot this out in a number of ways. That may be one explanation for why this time they succeeded and the other times they didn't. But I am very hesitant to make predictions about what will come next. There is something in politics called the power of a good example. It's very dangerous. And right now, hopes have been ignited, not just in the Middle East, it's spreading to Africa too. I mean, and I think it will spread in many other places, including here. When people think that real change is possible, it's as if you've just moved a knob, you know, a couple of clicks higher. Normal times we all say, why bother, right? Nothing ever changes. You know, whatever effort it is, it's going to fail. So now you have a wave of people who think differently, and I think that's a very, very serious challenge. And the question, and we were talking about this before, so I'm going to, you know, prefigure what I'm sure David's also going to say, is how repressive are these regimes willing to be, right? Because in Egypt, the idea of making a concession to buy people off, I mean, obviously that it didn't work. It was actually seen as weakness. So now, you know, are we going to see them, you know, take out the guns and just mow people down?
So is that what you think the lesson has been?
Well, there are several lessons here, and we have to approach each one of them with modesty because, as Mika pointed out, we didn't predict this. Certainly, those of us who write about these subjects in the New York Times, both abroad and from Washington, didn't predict it. We had good company. The CIA missed the Tunisia uprising, and then when it happened, told the president that it was probably 20% or less chance that this would spread to anything that would cause Mubarak any trouble. They had good company because Israeli intelligence had essentially the same assessment. In fact, the depth of our ignorance was such. I worked fairly extensively on WikiLeaks for several months before we published the WikiLeaks series, and was making my way through the subject matter that we thought was most vital: Iran, North Korea, rendition, so forth and so on. I never looked at the Tunisia material. It just never struck me that there was going to be a reason. Now, we had 250,000 documents and 241 million words, and we had to make some choices. But I'll have to, you know, I'll return my undergraduate degree the next time I come up here for that failing. So you start off with the Yogi Berra rule, which is don't make predictions, particularly about the future. Then going forward, let's ignore Yogi for just a moment and sort of think about what it was that sparked in Egypt that may or may not apply. The Egyptian military, as we've all read and all written, is a unique institution that had its bond with the people in part because of its neutral stance. When the Saudis were on the phone with President Obama and his staff last week, before Mubarak fell, they were saying, you have to stand by Mubarak, even if he opens fire on the protesters. Now, the U.S. obviously didn't sign on to that, but gives you a different mentality out there. In Bahrain, it's still dicey. 2 were killed yesterday. The king then said there would be an investigation, but this isn't over by a long shot. In Iran, I think there's not a whole lot of doubt that people would open fire, the forces would open fire. So there is the possibility that many of these could end more like Tiananmen and less like happened in Egypt. One last point on doing the comparison. I think that the technology can certainly make this spread like wildfire. But the lessons that some of the regimes must have learned from the way Mubarak was so slow on this, one would think would get through. And you heard President Obama reinforcing those at his news conference yesterday, where he basically said, if you took away all the nice words, whatever these folks want, give it to them fast. And he was saying this mostly to America's friends in the region. To the protesters in Iran and to some degree Syria, he was saying, have at it.
Right, go for it. You know. But so do you think that there's this contradiction in the messages that we're sending to folks in the region? Do you think that Niall Ferguson, our colleague here, thinks that Obama really made a hash of all of this, that we neither really fully sided with the people who were protesting, nor did we side with our old allies, and so now they both hate us. Do you buy that argument?
Well, there was certainly, in the public communication side of this, there were certainly a few missteps along the way. Remember, day one of this was Secretary Clinton saying Egypt is stable and President Mubarak is moving slower than he needs to toward reform. Fortunately for her, she had just given a speech in Doha 2 weeks before that pushed people to further reform. Then you had Vice President Biden on TV. Hard to believe this was only, a little over 2 weeks ago, refusing to say if President Mubarak was a dictator. He regretted that almost as soon as he said that. President Obama then moved the ball forward after 2 conversations with Mubarak. One on the Friday night after Mubarak gave his first speech, the second on the Tuesday night, just 2 weeks ago, after his second sort of defiant speech. And he got on the phone with him before he went out in public, and he said, I'm going to say that you've got to reform more quickly. And President Mubarak, from the accounts we've heard, threw up every old argument that the Egyptians have used over the years. He said, first of all, President Nasser faced down something a lot worse than this. Second, he said, give me a few days. He literally said, when I call you back in a few days, a call that never happened, you'll see that I was right. Basically, this will all go away. Third thing he said was, this is all Muslim Brotherhood. This is all outsiders. And at some point, President Obama interrupted him and said, we don't think this is all outsiders. And in his last conversation, he said, this was sort of interesting coming from a 49-year-old president talking to an 82-year-old president. He said, I respect my elders. You've been in politics for a long time. And Mr. President, 30 years. But sometimes what worked in the past doesn't work in the future. And his message was, I think you're in one of those. And it's clear that Mubarak didn't believe that, and Mubarak's view was what had worked in the past would work in the future, and it looks like he was being egged on in that thought by his son, Gamal.
Yeah, that's what the reports are, that basically, in fact, that on Thursday, Mubarak was getting ready actually to resign, and that Gamal came out and told him, listen, don't resign, just make a nice speech to the people, telling them that, you're their father and you want to, make things right, and of course it inflamed people further.
At 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, so this would have been just a few hours before that muddled speech, Vice President Suleiman, who had been, of course, the intel chief, called into Vice President Biden at the White House. Vice President Biden was in his office in the West Wing. There were a number of senior American officials who gathered around the speakerphone to hear this. And basically what Vice President Suleiman laid out was that President Mubarak would transfer all of his powers except for 3 that he believed could not be transferred under the Constitution. Dissolving the parliament, firing the cabinet. I'm sure I'm forgetting here.
Initiating amendments to the Constitution.
That's right. Initiating amendments. Thank you. And that apart from that, he would transfer everything to Suleiman. And that would be the message. And then he would disappear to Sharm el-Sheikh or wherever he may be today. And Mr. Suleiman was very specific about these. And people were taking notes. And, as we've done these reconstructions, we've sort of pieced together those. So then the speech happens a few hours later, and the bit about transferring powers was almost done as a parenthetical phrase. And it wasn't just the U.S. that missed it. Everybody in the square missed it. You saw that on TV as people reacted in the square. And then the conversation between Washington and the military began. Whatever President Mubarak thought he was doing, he didn't answer the mail here. And I think that's what led to the military's final decision.
So you do think it was a military decision, that this was actually a kind of soft coup by the military?
You know, it's hard to say that replacing a military regime with a military regime is a soft coup, but if you can, under those circumstances, doing that, that's right. I think that they believed, and you know, we're going to learn a lot about this, I suspect, over the next year or two as people get debriefed coming out of this. But I suspect that from Suleiman through the military leadership, they thought they had a deal with President Mubarak that he simply couldn't bring himself to utter when he gave that speech. And none of them had seen the speech before he gave it.
And they wouldn't have insisted on seeing that? I mean, if they had thought they'd made a deal with him? Or do you think they just said, you know, let the old man take as many shots on goal as possible, maybe the speech will assuage people and they'll go home, and it's only when the last gambit failed that they said, okay, you know, Hosni, I think it's time to go?
You would have loved to have been the fly on the wall when he was done with the speech and put it down and the lights go out and he says, so, how'd that go?
Oh, it was pre-taped, right? It wasn't actually a live speech.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they say he fainted twice during it, actually.
Really?
Yeah. So here's the question for you, Mika, is that, so, you know, was Mubarak a little bit justified when he talked to Obama and said, listen, this is not a big deal, because after all, as you noted, right, huge digital divide in Egypt. The peasantry, you know, my people, these people don't have the internet. They're not on Twitter. They're not on Facebook. So was Mubarak right in the sense that he thought if he could just hold out against this narrow group of very active, you know, urban people, then the vast majority of Egyptians were still behind?
Well, you know, I've been thinking about this. You know, there are probably a dozen ways that this movement could have been stopped had, you know, on the first day, on January 25th, there were all these different feeder marches to get to Tahrir Square, and I think one report was 8 out of 9 were stopped by the police. So one made it to the square, and that was the seed. If they had all been stopped, then it would have been, okay, you know, did they pick another day for their big, you know, the launch of the revolution? And, you know, so there are many moments where this could have gone and hit a wall or been suppressed. And so it's quite likely that, you know, you've been running a police state for 30 years, and so far everything's, you know, it's all your tricks have worked the last 10 times you've had to use them. Yeah. Why think differently this time? I do think by the end, where you had 5 million people demonstrating around the country, and not just in Cairo, that it was over for the Mubarak regime, at least him and his son, not necessarily the military, as David's correctly pointing out. I mean, I think we're in a really interesting period now where it's not quite clear where power and legitimacy rests. I thought it was fascinating to see some of the leaders of this youth movement meeting with the generals and then releasing their notes of that meeting online, right? They're behaving in a completely different way. They're saying our legitimacy comes from being transparent and you know, sharing everything and involving everyone. They've had this wonderful thing, both with Facebook and Google Moderator, where they're asking people, so we want all your ideas on how we should fix Egypt. So there is a kind of legitimacy that's being formed in this movement that the military doesn't have. The military is in a competition, if you will, for, you know, who is seen as, you know, legitimately the normative leaders of the country. And, you know, I obviously Mubarak was completely out of touch with this this phenomenon, and in thinking that if he just held out another day, that people would give up. The other thing is we forget that people, they keep saying they broke the barrier of fear, right? You know, and this was true in the civil rights movement in the United States. I mean, when people marched and were willing, using nonviolent methods, to get their heads bashed in. You know, once people decide that they're willing to give their lives for something, They do amazing things. And a lot of people were saying in the last few days, just before Mubarak finally capitulated, that they knew that if they lost, they would die. They knew they'd be, or they'd be in prison and tortured. So there was a sort of a in it to, I can't believe I'm going to say in it to win it. But, that people were committed. They were putting, well, not killed, because it was amazing how nonviolent this was, actually. But
it does remind you a little bit, though, of what you read about the signers of the Declaration here in 1776, who knew as they were signing it that if this thing went bad, they were all goners. And there was an element of that, because these the names behind this were very well known. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we've had a lot of people saying in recent times that the military is going to take over again, and this will just be another military government. And over time, that may well be, although we do have some examples, South Korea being probably the most interesting, and Indonesia right after that, of the military relaxing rule and sharing power and ultimately allowing free elections. And in South Korea, the first presidents who got elected were in fact former generals, and then over time civilians and dissidents got elected. But in this particular case, I think the dynamic, at least for right now, is that the military is more scared of the crowds than the crowds are of the military. Because the military has already demonstrated that it will not fire on the crowds. Okay, now that could change. But
I don't fully, David, do we really know? I mean, 300 people is the rough estimate of how many people were killed. And there are reports of the military, or branches of the military, arresting people and torturing people. So I'm not sure what that tells us. Again, I'm not an expert on the internals of this.
If Mubarak is 50 years old when this happens, does the military let go of him just as easily as they did?
I don't think so. I think they looked at Mubarak and they said, I'm not investing in an 82-year-old guy with no successor.
Right. In other words, that's a key part of
his stock had pretty well depleted at this point. Yeah.
Right.
Who had been off for medical treatment. Another way to ask that question, Eric, would have been, if he did have a clear successor, if there was a Kim Jong-un equivalent in Egypt, if there had been, a vice president who constitutionally could take power, would the military have perhaps aligned themselves with the successor? The fact that, and I don't know the answer to this question, and it's one of those counterfactuals we'll never know, but the fact that the military had no place else to go, they had to choose between an 82-year-old in poor health and whatever the crowd had behind the curtain.
Right. So now we've got the crowd, right? The crowd is basically the main force in Egyptian politics pitted against this military. And now the military is saying we're going to amend the Constitution, we're going to have some elections. Does this crowd have what it takes to kind of translate the really impressive power they have on the street into, power in political institutions? Can they transform themselves into something that can win elections on behalf of this reform agenda?
My sense is actually that the leaders of this movement don't plan to run for office as much as ensure a transition to a more democratic constitution, create the space where parties can then compete. And then what happens after that, we don't know. But that this networked organism, there's a phrase that Yochai Benkler, who teaches here at Harvard, he calls it the network public sphere, right? Which is a different kind of a set of relationships that we see when networked media sort of rises up alongside broadcast media. And what we saw in Tahrir was, in a way, that brought to life in the flesh. And it was fascinating to see how that, how in the first few days it was chaotic, but by the end it was highly structured. There were clinics and there were people taking care of kids, and
there was cleanup day.
And the cleanup day afterwards. So all of that says something about a certain kind of social capital that's been created here and that's inspiring a lot of people. And it is radically different from, I mean, I've been to Egypt once and 20 years ago, and all I remember was decay and a sense of, you know, just this ancient place that was being allowed to just continue to decay, and a sense of no pride in taking care, you know, of the public spaces. And so this is a very, very big change. And I also think we shouldn't underestimate what it meant for people all over the world, and in particular in the region and in the rest of Egypt, when they finally were able to see, you know, state media flipping, right? I mean, that interview with Wael Ghonim, which so many people saw, and then the next day the crowds surged again, because it was sort of a breakthrough what the mainstream media, the state-controlled media in Egypt was telling everybody. And now that's only going to get further embedded. All that said, what I have in mind is what happened in South Africa, you know, where the ANC comes into power, but doesn't, you know, we get a political reconciliation, but we don't get an economic revolution, right? The ANC basically compromised away most of its economic demands.
You know,
So, you know, the same sort of thing may happen in Egypt.
the history of these is that people who run good revolutions don't necessarily fill potholes, turn on electricity, and invest, you know, in their people. So I think of Arafat as an example here. Right. Certainly, President Mubarak, as you say, the public spaces in Cairo, when you consider that you've got this fabulous ancient society that lived off of tourism and could usher people through all of that. The public spaces, even along the Nile, as Tom Friedman wrote in his column this morning, were basically allowed to decay to the point that the message that the Egyptian people got was that Mubarak was not investing in them. And depending on how many billions you think he's left with, he was certainly investing in the family business. Okay, right. So that creates a dynamic here that you don't see, for example, in China, another place that has worked very hard on controlling the internet, that uses it for all the things that Mika points out and following who the opposition is. You can say many things of the Chinese, but you cannot say that they aren't investing in people and infrastructure. The hard part about driving around Beijing these days, and I've been there twice in the past couple of months, is there are so many construction projects going on that it backs up the already terrible traffic, and now everybody's got a car. That was not the case in Cairo.
But I want to not to be too idealistic about this, but there is something that's happening all over the world now as we connect and grow up being networked. And I don't think there's any reason to expect that Egypt wouldn't be part of this too, which is that the old approach to government, which is, you know, you put your money in and you expect, you know, services out the other end. And when the vending machine version of government doesn't work, you just sort of shake the machine and ask for a refund. That is, as we get networked, we're also networking governance too. And it's, you know, it's people putting, you know, using their cell phones to take pictures of potholes and put them on a map, and then forming neighborhood volunteer committees to fill them themselves. And there is no reason why this phenomenon cannot also take hold, and probably is already part of what's happening in Egypt. There was self-organization, the police, right, dissolved, and then you had all these neighborhood watch committees formed. So I'm not, you know, I mean, I agree with you, David, that the revolutionaries are not necessarily good politician, you know.
Maybe these revolutionaries are. I was saying that those who went before, and of course these revolutionaries are highly wired, highly professional, and have traveled abroad and can see what the difference is. That's the difference between Cairo and North Korea.
Well, and also, you know, let's not underestimate how fast information moves now and how many people are probably streaming there going to join in and help out.
That's right.
And the degree to which also methods, both political protest and political organization, are going to get copied. What people did in the streets of Cairo is going to get used in the streets of London and vice versa. And so I think that, you know, what we're seeing, again, it may be the high point, very special case because of all the conditions that we're building up in Egypt anyway, but it is part of a larger wave too.
Well, so, you know, the interesting thing that you say about sort of using the power of these networks, tools to you know, fill in where the government isn't. You know, Wael Ghanem, the Google executive, actually, before he did any of this, one of his projects was a kind of to make a digital heat map of garbage collection in Cairo, and so to sort of where people need to, you know, focus on cleaning up the street. And in fact, the interviewer who interviewed him in that very famous segment was, you know, not from the state media, but she was actually had been working with him on precisely that project. But I guess the question still is, these guys have proven themselves very good at organizing protests, at maybe doing the kinds of things that you're describing, but don't they need to get good at, you know, supporting political candidates? They don't have to field their own candidates, but don't they somehow have to transform themselves into a political organization in order to inherit the post-Mubarak era?
Well, I think look, we've been waiting to see what happens when people who grow up living and breathing, being networked, enter politics. Do they become the same as the generation above them, or do they behave in a completely different way? And right now, they're behaving in a completely different way, okay? I mean, the leaders don't normally post the full text of their notes of a private meeting with the generals online so that everybody can see what just happened. They don't tweet and respond back and forth in this hyper-transparent, interactive way. These are new patterns, and they derive a lot of legitimacy from using them, and a lot of power. People trust them because they're being transparent. So what you're saying is, will they go back to the old political, you know, I don't think so. I think the old political parties are going to be swept aside by new formations that are going to behave differently. They're going to, yeah, they'll be called political parties too. But it's striking, again, when you look at how many of these young activists, whether they were young members of the Muslim Brotherhood or young members of Ayman Noor's party. You know, in Samantha Shapiro's piece, she has a wonderful depiction of how, you know, many of them met each other as young party activists in these quasi-opposition formations in Egypt, but got really frustrated with the older leaders and the pecking order and how long it took them to make decisions and how everything was cliquish and closed. Okay? So I'm not convinced that they now go and reproduce what, you know, it's like, okay, now it's my turn to be the big boss of a political party, as opposed to being a network weaver, okay? And that's a different style of doing politics. I think we're going to see it spread. Will some of the more traditional people like Mohammed al-Baradei, you know, they seem to have formed an alliance with him. Yeah, they're going to make some pragmatic choices. They have to support somebody who can, you know, be elected and run the, you know, be the titular leader of the country. But something fundamental is changing, I think.
All right. Well, so I think now we should turn it over to our very able audience. We have about 45 minutes for questions. What we'll do is we have a couple of microphones on the ground floor and then 2 microphones up there, but I think we can all just use the microphones down here. Now, there's a few ground rules that I've been asked to articulate. The first is that all questioners must identify themselves. If you could also provide us with some identification written, that would also be good. One brief question per person, so please no speeches, no prefatory remarks, and then finally questions must end with a question mark. So please do ask a question as opposed to hurling accusations, recriminations, etc. So we'll start over here. Yes, sir.
My name is Michael Brower. I got master's and PhD degrees from this school before it was even the Kennedy School about 100 years ago. I'm very impressed with your discussion of the role of the people, especially with technology. My concern is the Army. My understanding from outside, with no inside knowledge at all, is that Mubarak was really, you know, supported by the Army, and the dictator before him supported by the Army. You've commented on the Army a little bit, but we don't have much experience around the world with armies creating democracy. Could you tell us more about this Egyptian army and how much hope we can put in them?
Well, this is the great mystery of what we're headed into. I mean, if at the end of this great revolution, you have a military-backed dictator for 30 years replaced by a military regime that doesn't carry through the reforms that are being discussed, then we're all going to ask, for all the Twittering, for all the Facebooking, what actually was accomplished. And that's what makes this the most perilous period that we're in many ways, much more perilous, although a whole lot less video-friendly than what we just went through. Everybody is looking at the Iran example, a case where the revolution had combined Islamic fundamentalists with professionals and others who were, in that year period after the Shah was forced out, gradually purged out of the system. And you now have a state 30 years later that is essentially run by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So there are long odds here. But there are some examples. We mentioned two before, in South Korea and in Indonesia. In Indonesia, Suharto was also supported greatly by the army, as had been his predecessor. And now there is, you know, a real democracy that I don't think any of us would have bet on existing 10 years ago. South Korea, another interesting example. I mentioned before that presidents ran, the first two presidents under a democratic system were in fact military leaders. It shifted over time. So I think when you talk to people in the administration about what worries them, they're most worried that the Army will not carry through on most of what they have seen happen so far, and I think that's a legitimate concern. That said, yesterday they put together a committee to do the constitutional reform, and it included people who a week ago you couldn't imagine anybody allowing to go work on devising a new constitution.
That's absolutely right. A committee of 8 people. It includes a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's chaired by someone who has sympathies with the Islamist trend in Egypt. But look, I think this question of what the military will do, this is obviously the essential question. And you're right, we do have examples of militaries actually relinquishing power. Portugal in 1974, Sudan. So my colleague Rami Khouri brought up that in Sudan in 1985.
Chile.
Chile. I mean,
can one of you clarify for me? Because my understanding of the military is that it's actually, you know, not been allowed to do much war fighting, and it's much more of an economic power than anything else.
It is an economic power, the way the Chinese military has become an economic power.
Industries that they run.
Right. Hotels, you know, it's hard to go into any significant industry in which they don't have an established industry. That may work in favor of a more democratic rule here, because they may believe that in order to get the revenue going, you've got to bring back stability. And if there's one thing we've learned, the way our perceptions have changed in the past month, is that a month ago, Mubarak was the equivalent of stability. And the reason that the administration ultimately pulled the plug on their support was they came to the conclusion that he came to personify instability.
right. I mean, the question is, do you think the military believes that you can have stability without a uniform general at the helm?
You know, we don't know that yet, and in Egypt, as in many of the other countries we described, there is no unitary military. You know, there are many gradations with many different business interests, many different political interests. Field Marshal Tantawi, who is now running the country in at least the closest thing to a leader that they have, is not somebody known for political ambitions. But the more he sits in that chair, he may begin to get some.
Well, you know, and the question, I mean, one thing that I have been heartened by is that this process of constitutional reform that they've initiated, it's actually been very limited. They haven't opened up the entire Constitution for amendment. Because, you know, if they did that, then all of that would divide the opposition very quickly. They'd, you know, be arguing over the role of the Sharia and the role of Islam in the state. And so they're simply saying we're going to amend these bits of the Constitution that deal with the way the president is elected. So that seems to me to signal that they actually do want to get this over with quickly. And whenever I talk to anybody in Egypt about, you know, my skepticism about militaries giving up power, they say, no, 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 no. This is completely different. The military knows that the Egyptian people will not accept any return to authoritarianism. And now we see there's a big celebration rally planned on Friday, which I think is also a way of demonstrating to the military, hey, listen, we haven't lost our fire, we haven't lost our organizing capacity,
right.
and we'll be back here if you guys don't follow through. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Seth Flaxman. I'm a second-year MPP student at the Kennedy School. So thank you guys for the great discussion. We talked a lot about the revolution spreading, sort of like a consensus that it's like there's like a spirit of revolution, and I agree. But in talking about it, there was no real distinction made between the spreading of the revolution against authoritarian regimes for democracy, and then Mika, a few times you had mentioned, you know, the revolutionary spirit coming to America or protests in London. And I know that there had been a sort of demonstration in Iraq this past week, which is the only democracy so far that this revolutionary spirit has spread to. So how do you see this playing out in democracies? Like in Iraq, they were literally just shaking the vending machine and saying, we want more government services.
Right.
But how do you see this evolving?
Well, I think the issue is how the democracies handle the recession and these austerity budgets that they're imposing, and what sorts of social forces, which are already there, but what they do in response to that, right? So, I mean, I was watching London, England, you know, really, but primarily London in the fall, where they've raised, you know, tuition for kids in public schools and universities. They've tripled tuition. And you've seen this massive wave of street protests, in many cases by middle school kids and high school kids. And then the police, you know, with tactics that in many cases I think are radicalizing a lot of the kids who are very middle class and just expecting, you know, it's always been part of my birthright to be able to afford to go to a good university and not, you know, have to pay as much as they're asking. You know, similarly in Britain, where, you know, the austerity plans of the current government are very, very tough. There is a very interesting grassroots movement that is trying to fight back by going after companies that don't pay any corporate taxes. And I just saw the first inklings that might begin to spread here. It depends what, you know, the Republicans manage to push through. I mean, right now we're going to go through a period of some perhaps significant spending cuts. There's something going on in Wisconsin right now where the governor is trying to break the public unions in the state with methods that some people are calling fascistic, and very large demonstrations taking place in response to that. I mean, in normal times we would say, you know, that's part of the ebb and flow, and it may well just be part of the ebb and flow of politics and popular responses. But there's something about seeing this sort of thing go from being normal to very unusual and in record time, and people doing it, you know, with surprising new tools and new leadership arising from among young people. And that's where the power, you know, it's the power of a dangerous example. So, you know, I mean, I'm eternally, you know, this is my failing is that, you know, I'm always more optimistic than I should be about, you know, what people will decide to do. And there's no question we have a lot of really good bread-in circuses, you know, to keep us from getting that politicized. But budget cuts could be, you know, the spark. Not for anything like what, I mean, I'm not trying to compare the situation in Western democracies to what just happened in Egypt, okay? I mean, they're obviously very, very different situations. But there is, the common trend to me is youth movements, okay? And it's youth who are connected and who are sharing symbols and expressions of hope and change that are very viral. And then what people do with that, that's the wild card. We don't know.
So in other words, we should not just be looking at you know, Yemen or Algeria to see where this goes next and who's inspired next, but we could be looking here too to see people inspired by
Well, let's just put it this way, that when the normal political process doesn't provide much source of inspiration, do people just go nowhere? I mean, I was very struck, I have to say, and I tweeted this a few days ago, you know, that Egypt shows what the youth of America who rallied behind Obama could have done if they had empowered themselves instead of empowering him. And because I was very struck that the night of the election in the United States, you know, in 2008, there were spontaneous rallies in cities all over the United States, and not just college towns, where thousands of people poured into the streets, singing, chanting until 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Just go on YouTube. People are smiling, right? Why are you smiling? You remember it. And the point is that when you experience something like that, and then we've been let down, right? I mean, obviously, we've gotten back to the grind of politics in many ways, and it's been a big letdown for people. But I don't think that memory of possibility goes away. I just think it sort of goes into the woodwork and waits until, you know, some creative group of organizers figures out how to spark it again.
You, sir.
Hi, thanks for coming out. My name is David. I'm a first-year student at the business school. My question is, considering that the global economy is still emerging from the macroeconomic recession and that much Egyptian unrest resulted from high unemployment, what implications do revolution and increasing unrest have on long-term economic development initiatives within the region? Thank you.
It's a very good question. So the impact on economic development in the region.
Well, you know, what's really fascinating and what made the Egyptian revolution so authentic was the fact that it really did rise up from largely economic causes. You know, you did not hear death to America. You didn't hear very much about Israel and Palestine. None of the usual things that most U.S. government projections would be about what would bring people into the streets was actually what brought them into the streets. So then the question comes, if you're doing this in societies where reform has been so slow that they've lost not one generation, but basically 2 generations of development work, how quickly can you bring that back up? You know, Syria and South Korea had similar sized economies in the mid-1950s. They do not today. And so there has been so much ground to be brought up that it almost makes you wonder how it is they're going to go about doing that. Now, the answer may lie in the set of professionals who have brought this technology to bear and who have traveled enough that they understand what needs to be done. But it requires so remaking the institutions of the societies that it's hard to imagine the current regime staying in place. And that's why you heard President Obama imploring the American allies in the region the other day, get out ahead of this. He said, get ahead of this curve. Now, one of the interesting things, you'll read a little bit about this in the Times tomorrow, is that last summer, President Obama started up he issued what's called a presidential study directive in August that was classified because they were looking at 4 or 5 different economies in the Middle East and asking the question, what are the best case and worst case scenarios of what could fall apart? Egypt was clearly one of them. They won't say what other countries they look at. They're happy to say Egypt because, you know, that whatever's happened there has happened. We suspect that the others probably included Bahrain, probably included Yemen. Sure, there were some others in there. And the question is, what could you do fast enough to keep these kind of forces at bay? And I'm not sure that they came to satisfying answers.
Very good. You, sir.
Thank you for this very thought-provoking conversation. I'm John Soda. I'm a freshman at the college from Turkey. I'm a simple-minded person, so I will ask a very simple question. Do you think we will see something of this size in the region in the near future, maybe within the next year? And what does this mean for Iran or China, where popular protests have failed so far?
So do you think we'll see another protest of the magnitude that we saw in Egypt elsewhere in the region within the year? What do you think?
Well, we've seen it within the week in Bahrain, and you've begun to see some others. You've seen Yemen as well. The question is, when you translate this to tribal societies, which Egypt does not really, does the same dynamic take place? And so that's one mystery that's out there. And secondly, when you're dealing, as we referred to before, with militaries that are willing to put this down with whatever force is necessary, does it translate as well?
But there is no country really with the magnitude of Egypt. I mean, this is the big one for the region, right? I mean, other than what, Iran? And, you know, we obviously, that situation is completely, it's different in many ways. So this is a huge explosion. I mean, do you imagine there's somewhere else where that we're missing?
But it sounds like, you know, when you were talking earlier, it sounds like you're saying the kind of raw materials for this exist in a lot of these societies.
Yeah.
And, you know, so, is it inevitable that they'll explode?
No, you know, I've been thinking, there's an academic named Dave Parry who's been doing a lot of writing about the role of the internet and social change, who had a very interesting post the other day about what happened when they shut down the internet in Egypt and why that was not successful in stopping this movement. And he said, you can shut down the public internet, but you can't shut off the internet public. And what he meant by that is that when a certain critical mass of people, and we don't know what that number is, and you know, I bet that's somewhere in that White House study too. Is it 20%, 30%? You know, and some of this is also how, you know, what the degree of urbanization, the degree of mobile usage, the size of the bulge of young people in the population. But once that all gets hooked up, right? Tunisia, to me, is really interesting in this case, because just 3 years ago, Tunisia had 50,000 Facebook users. Now it has nearly 2 million. Okay, part of the change was that Facebook got translated into French in 2008, and people started signing up to use it. Also, after briefly banning it, the Tunisian government allowed people to use it. But then once you've got people hooked up, and even with the government trying to shut it down in a moment of crisis, they've learned a new pattern of behavior, which is networked. And they've made new connections. You know, to Malcolm Gladwell's point about weak ties, right? These are lots of weak ties, but many of them foster stronger ties. That's the point that Gladwell missed. And out of those strong ties now, and they're flourishing. I mean, and this explosion in Egypt has just now generated another wave of open ability to connect like that is also being spread around the region. So, you know, I've long believed, as Margaret Mead said, that, you know, you should never underestimate the power of a small group of people to change the world. That's the only thing that ever has. Well, now we're seeing many more small groups forming out of this raw material of being connected. So I'm betting on more, not less.
But it still doesn't tell you what the triggering mechanism is. And, you know, Leon Panetta was asked this the other day when he was doing that testimony in which he said that he understood that Mubarak was going to step down, and it turned out he was a little ahead of the news. But he said another point, you know, he's from California. Everybody knows there's going to be a big earthquake. Nobody has quite figured out how to measure the tension well enough to know what triggers it off. And we're seeing that happen right now. You know, we thought the trigger mechanism happened in Iran in 2009, right. And it turned out it didn't. And, you know, we keep asking the question here, is this going to go from Egypt to Bahrain to Iran? I think maybe the better way to ask the question was Iran first?
Yeah, and Iran was an unfinished revolution, and then the Egyptian activists, some of them, spent a lot of time studying what went wrong after the protests in 2 years ago. You know, I don't like the earthquake analogy, and because it suggests that revolutions are like, you know, natural phenomenon, you know, that they're unpredictable and they happen, they're acts of God, they're organized. And they don't always work, but it takes organizers. Yeah. Obviously, you know,
some earthquakes happen because people pump too much water into the ground.
Well, right, but no, I'm not disagreeing with you that there are other external conditions that either help or hurt, right? Organizers actually use a term, which is what are the organizing conditions, right? So when people are, you know, happy and they believe in the regime and they think their lives are going to get better, don't try and organize a revolution in those circumstances. But it still takes organizing. And my point is simply that connection technologies and techniques are now, this social knowledge, this rich social knowledge is become available to many, many more people. And they have a lot of reasons to go looking for it and sharing. And so I think we will see more attempts. Not all of them will succeed. But that's what's going on right now.
Very good. All right, sir.
Thank you. My name is Alan Bradley. I'm a senior at the college here and also a reporter for the undergraduate radio station, WHRB. I have two related questions. I'll try and keep them brief. But to start, just yesterday I got in my email forwarded from a friend a YouTube video of a song that an Egyptian artist had recorded and then created a music video walking through Tahrir Square. Mm-hmm. Very inspiring work. And I'm wondering to what extent that type of behavior, social media across the border, across the ocean, from the Middle East to the United States, can change the way public opinion in the United States is formed, thus changing the way the United States formulates foreign policy, despite all the barriers. And then related question, just from a history class here at Harvard, the impression that I got is that the Arab world, across many state borders within the Arab world, it has a lot of cultural resonance with itself. The borders are very porous culturally. Mm-hmm. And so to what extent does that make the pan-Arab world very fertile ground for the type of networking behavior that you've been talking about?
Yeah. That's actually a good question. I mean, you know, your piece talked a little bit about
the move from Tunisia to Egypt.
Yeah.
And that was one of the fascinating things here, that not only did the technology and communications happen, but at some point, just before the protests in Egypt happened, some of the Tunisians actually came over and gave, you know, tutorials in person. We're not talking about, you know, just over Facebook. So the connections, those bonds that you described, got stronger from the personal connection. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's one other set of bonds out here that we haven't discussed that I think also played a very big role. You know, whenever there is a significant human rights violation or something, there's usually people saying, let's cut off the military-to-military relationships between countries. Well, in Egypt, we've had this military-to-military relationship for a long time. And generals have gotten to know each other, and corporals have gotten to know each other. And that all paid off for the Pentagon in a very big way in the past couple of weeks, because they had everybody sort of emailing and saying, time to stay quiet, you know, you want to remember why the institution is revered in Egypt. And had there not been personal connections, had these just been emails arriving from people they didn't know, I don't think they would have had much effect. But I think it was a very deep relationship.
Right. There was the first part of your question was about something different, was whether this affects how the public participates in the debates about U.S. foreign policy or in the making of U.S. foreign policy. So I would say that there is a change, there's a deep change beginning to happen there too. I think WikiLeaks is actually a bigger piece of that. It's not done. I mean, foreign policy is one of those things that, has traditionally been the least, the president and the State Department, can act in as far less of a democratic manner than, say, making domestic policy. And the question is whether that conversation is being opened up in ways that the public will get involved in. And I just don't know. I mean, I think that, again, it's part of that cycle of hope and despair, right? We've had successive waves of public engagement over things like the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. And, at the moment, public opinion is, 50–60% opposed to continuing in Afghanistan. But there's been nothing to galvanize that into any kind of push. And, for Obama, it's advantageous to him because it happens to be one of the issues where he gets more Republican support than Democratic support, right? So for his balancing act, he's not exactly going to disrupt that. But we just don't know if that will change. I mean, the United States does go through phases of greater popular engagement with issues of foreign policy and then lesser ones. We're right now in one of the lesser ones.
I kind of heard you to be saying, though, that, what happened in Egypt and some of the images that we're seeing from Egypt fundamentally changed the way we view that part of the world. That's kind of one thing I heard you to be saying. And that would be a good thing. I think if the narrative of the Middle East shifts now from, 9/11, source of a place that is a source of security threats, to maybe a place that is a source of kind of inspiration and hope.
I have to say, to the benefit of the Egyptian movement in particular, it's great how how many are able to communicate in English on our media. I mean that is again going to change the perception of Arabs and Muslims in ways that could be very positive.
And there are two, I think, related elements to this. Number one, it created a narrative that was not the narrative of Al-Qaeda, and it was not the narrative of Iran. So there was an alternative, and this was the bubble up issue. The second one was it created a level of interest in the United States that I think took all of us by surprise, that we were all glued to our TV sets. I saw a statistic yesterday internally within the Times that in the hour after President Mubarak resigned, the number of page views to the New York Times website was about 1 million page views in 1 hour's time. Mm-hmm. I'm trying, to remember what other event would have brought that together.
We would be remiss if we didn't say that this has mainstreamed Al Jazeera. I mean, until this moment, I think Al Jazeera was kind of out there, just beyond the pale of acceptable, because of all the associations that have been built up around them, I think unfairly. And there were so many, I've seen some of the data that has been released by a site called Chartbeat, which actually tracks the live use of the Al Jazeera webpage. And the bulk of the traffic they were getting was from the United States. And it was driven by social media also. Another very interesting thing. People tweeting or linking off Facebook or whatever it was, pointing to where you could watch Al Jazeera in English. And they were getting millions of views from the United States. I wouldn't be surprised if they finally end up on some cable channels now.
I suspect they will.
And that will also be interesting because Al Jazeera's style of political coverage is more substantive than what we get from the 3 main cable channels in the United States. So it would be very interesting to have that added element of competition.
Too substantive for Mubarak's taste. They really blame Al Jazeera for
I actually think Al Jazeera gets a big share of the credit.
So, you, ma'am.
My name is Katie Peters. I'm a second-year MPP candidate here. I would like to sort of come back to being more specifically about Egypt and back to something of the question of what comes next. We're all watching. Everyone is attached, and I think that the international attention, and particularly at the simple public level, can actually help shape what happens if we're all sort of viewing intelligently and able to respond and able to put pressure in the right places to support what's going on in both Tunisia and Egypt. It's amazing how quickly we've stopped talking about Tunisia already. But
Tunisia was important only in sparking Egypt. No,
We can't ignore the Maghreb, please.
No. That was a joke. Yeah.
I know. But when we can't predict what's going to happen next, but we have some basic idea of what are good signs. When you're looking to try and influence an election, who gets to rule out parties, who gets to decide who's on the ballot? These things clearly matter in all situations. Professor Massoud in particular, what triggers or moments are you going to be watching as either signs for hope or for despair? David, what would trigger you to write an article going, hold on, the process doesn't look to be on track anymore? What moments are going to affect what happens next, not what will happen in them?
Oh, that's a great question. For me, I think I'm a very cynical individual and very hopeless in general. I'm actually pretty disturbed right now. I feel that they're not doing things in the right order, in the order that I wanted them to do them in. I don't like the fact that the Constitution is suspended and we're basically at the mercy of this military to hand over power. I'm very concerned that the constitutional amendments that they're working on are really only about making it easier for folks to run for the presidency. And they're getting rid of one article, for example, in the Constitution, Article 93, that declares that the Parliament determines the qualification of its own members, which, in Egypt basically has meant that somebody runs for Parliament, they rig the election in his favor, he wins, I go and sue that person, I win in court, and the Parliament says, doesn't matter, this court case doesn't mean anything, this guy who won by rigging is going to sit in the Parliament. And obviously that's terrible. However, that's just good separation of powers. We have that in the U.S. Constitution. Our legislatures determine the qualifications of their own members. So they want to get rid of that, but they're not really addressing sort of the core issues. They're not trimming the imperial powers of the presidency. I'd love to see them do away with the presidency. I'd love to see them start with a parliamentary election as opposed to a presidential election. Get some folks in Parliament who represent these people on the street and get them to sit down and amend the Constitution, start from scratch, do whatever you want, but at least it will be a popular group of people who are elected as opposed to 8 guys led by an Islamist. And so I am very nervous.
How do we get to
that? Pardon?
How do we get to that?
I don't think we're going to get, it's over. That's too late now. Nobody cares about what I think. But so having said all of that, my ability to peer behind the scenes or to peer into the future of Egyptian politics, even though I've spent lots of years studying it, is zero. So I think there's reason for optimism, mainly because of the kinds of stuff that Mika has been talking about, which is simply that these people are organized and they're going to demand their rights and they're not going away.
Right. Well, I was sort of hoping that Tarek would develop some passion about this subject, but and I think there are some interesting lessons we've learned, Kate, from watching what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. When I was White House correspondent for the Times during the Bush administration, there was a great desire within the Bush administration to start up parliamentary elections right away, even if there wasn't much of a constitutional basis, because their sense was that newly liberated people wanted to express that new liberation, and they were doing that by voting. And how many times do you see those pictures of people coming out with the ink on their finger? And it was, great and inspiring. But what we discovered was it is possible at times to hold a parliamentary election too early and not have the institutions that then make all of the government work together. And it's very frustrating because you want to show people right away that they're getting the benefits of this. There's been a lot of interesting academic work done about how you pace this stuff? And the answer is there's no simple answer. In every culture, it is quite different. We also know that you could have a constitution that is written with a clarity that would make all of us as Americans feel terrific, and depending on how that is interpreted, whether or not it's considered to be a vital document, you may or may not have adherence to it. There was an Egyptian constitution, but it was ignored on regular occasion, and I'm no expert on Egyptian politics. I lived in Tokyo for 6 years as the Times correspondent and bureau chief there. There is an American written constitution. It was initially written in English and translated into Japanese, and yet how it operates, the words look very familiar. How it operates looks very unfamiliar to us. So we may be investing in the wrong benchmarks here.
I have two that I'd add to that list. One, I'm disturbed by reports that the military have outlawed the right to strike. And I think labor rights is very, very important. What will happen when some independent union tries to, in defiance of that, we'll see. But that's a critical flashpoint. And the other one is whether they move quickly to release political prisoners. And if they don't, that's another very worrisome sign.
And they haven't so far. I will say about the constitutional amendment bit, I mean, I think that, they haven't amended enough, they're not planning to amend enough of the Constitution for my taste, but you could also amend too much, right? So I do like the fact that they're not opening some of the really contentious issues that would divide the opposition.
And we are only 6 days into
And
this.
we are only 6 days into the
We're on internet
post-Mubarak
time.
post-Mubarak future. Yes, sir. I think, will this be the last question, or do we have time for one
There's
more?
a young lady there who's been waiting for a long time.
Oh, where? Okay. Well, we'll go to him, and then we'll go to you. Okay.
Good evening. My name is Shri Mulay. I'm a physician and a student at the Harvard Extension School. I'm also chair of the United Submitters International. Throughout this time, we've heard a lot of talk about the Islamists. The real question is, how did the Islamists reconcile their role with democracy? It seems as if there's two totally contradictory ideas going on here. The Islamists would like to establish Sharia law, and democracy is what the people want. And this is a very important question, because when you look at England, for example, there is a democracy there already, and the Islamists, the people, some of the Islamists of that kind of background want to change the rules in England, for example. So how do you think the Islamists reconcile their conflict?
With democracy. Okay, great. And why don't we take your question as well, and we can deal with both of them at the same time, please.
Okay. I guess mine has something to do with that. So despite the administration's initial response, the U.S. administration's response to this, clearly we have a vested interest in the area. We saw Obama's first speech abroad was in Cairo, promoting both freedom and peace and stability. But we've seen that those two become conflicting ideals recently. So given that, and also Egypt's history of having a prominent role in determining political developments in the region, what impact would a decisive decision or a decisive opinion on part of the U.S. have had on both the political developments that have been occurring since Egypt's initial protests, and also what kind of consequences would that have had on our relationship with the Middle East as a whole?
So you mean you mean a decisive, statement by the United
Sure,
States?
either taking the side of the president and backing that authoritarian regime with stability, or supporting democratic protests.
Right. So two important questions here. First of all, the Islamists, who are important in a post-Mubarak future, are they going to be Democrats or not? And then this question of, really, I think what you're really asking is, how much ability did the United States have to tip this one way or the other?
Well, let me start with the second question first, because it goes more to the questions I was reporting on in the past few weeks, and then we'll turn to this really interesting question here. And I offer these up with no hard answers, because I don't think there are any. if you go back to the Cairo speech that President Obama gave, I thought one of the interesting moments in that speech, apart from the parts that we all know about calling for greater democracy in the region, was when he almost apologized for the U.S. role in the Iranian coups in the 1950s and Mossadegh and that whole period. And one of the consistent elements I've seen in covering President Obama has been his allergy to having the United States get out and seem to be dictating the futures of societies in the Middle East and elsewhere. Now you remember that he got elected in only 7 years, 6 years, 5 years after we had invaded a Middle Eastern country. And he had argued during the campaign that this was, a fundamental error that we had made. So I think that when you hear him say this is for the Egyptian people to decide, not for the American people to decide, I actually think he probably really means that. Mm-hmm. That said, this wasn't about us. And while I think the U.S. could affect it on the margins, particularly with the military for the reasons that I described before, my sense is that the American role in this was sort of 10 to 20% on the outside. I'd be interested to know whether you folks would view that differently. On the Islamist question that you had, this is the battle throughout the region. Turkey has managed it one way, although in recent times there have been some concerns about that. Iran obviously managed it a very different way 30 years ago. And as you go state to state, each one is reconciling that in different ways. Some places allow Sharia law as a local law, but not necessarily as federal law. You've seen this issue come up in Afghanistan, a place where I would say our influence is probably a lot greater than 10 or 20%, but still the issues come up about the stoning case and all of these others. This is going to be the hardest question because the far Islamist parties, in the end, see the democracy as something that they can use to take over and win the Sharia law, and many others, particularly in the West, see democracy as something to dilute this effort.
So I want to offer two, I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit with two observations for you about the way the network public sphere interferes with the old Islamist vision of imposing Sharia law. The first one is that these are highly personal, this medium is very, very personal. And in particular, Facebook, we'll just take as an example, it's your face, it's your name, it's your words, people are commenting directly back and forth to each other, and so there's a level of intimate engagement that makes some of the hard-edged, black and white choices, I think, less realistic for this generation as opposed to the older generation. The second thing is I've been really struck by how much the language of this revolution is about Egypt. The patriotic language that we're all Egyptians. There's a embrace of division within that. That's very, very promising. It may yet devolve into something that looks more like the way the blogosphere in Iran looks, right? Where you have, a secular cluster and you have very strong Islamist clusters, and they, some are very pro-regime and some are very anti-regime, or it may evolve like to what we have here in the U.S., which is also siloed and to a certain degree polarized. But I think there's something about how intimate the medium is itself that is going to make we're going to see some kind of Islamic democracy. I think that the thing that's so interesting about this is the possibility of a third way that isn't either the military that's stable and pro-U.S. Or these regimes that are very strongly opposed and radicalized. That's the thing that seems to be, there's a seed there for, and if we can somehow nurture it. I think Obama, it's interesting, if he came out too strongly, this is why this debate over whether the State Department should be actively, reaching out and helping activists in the region, if that's helpful or not. Some of these activists, one of the key activists in Tunisia, Sami Ben Garbia, I strongly recommend you look him up and look for his critique of the State Department's approach to internet freedom. Because his point is, let us do this ourselves, but when you come in and sort of put your arms around us, it actually makes our work harder because of the history of the United States in the region. So I think
it allows every autocrat to step in and say, this is an American-inspired.
Exactly. And so to the degree that Obama has had a certain good instinctive touch here, part of that is to let them do it themselves rather than be seen as this heavy hand, because there is a very bad history of the United States in the region from Iran forward, and that lesson, hopefully, let's not repeat it.
It's very interesting, actually, this idea that Islamists may be, challenged by the kind of intimacy of the social networking medium. Note that in the Muslim Brotherhood case, they actually started their own Facebook called Ikhwan Book, that Muslim brothers from around the it's happened. And if you look at the Muslim Brothers' early history, right? They had a newspaper, and they had one of these early pen pal networks, and it was they would list names and addresses of Muslim brothers in Egypt who wanted to get to know Muslim brothers outside. So the thing about them is that they're good at the social networking stuff that you're talking about. The digital divide in Egypt isn't just between rich and poor, it's between Islamists and non-Islamists. The Islamists have had a tremendous web presence, but they're also able to translate it into boots on the ground, going and campaigning in elections. Now, but that does suggest, though, because they spend a lot of time campaigning and running in elections, they've at least come to some kind of peace with democracy, at least in its procedural sense. Look, the idea about what we could have done to tip this one way or the other, I guess I want, this is the last thing, and I wanted to kind of throw it to David. My sense of this, watching this, was it kind of threw me back to Bush 1. And, the sense that everybody said that Bush 1 was the right guy to kind of oversee or be there as the process of the disintegration of the Soviet Union happened, because he didn't have this kind of arrogance, this desire to go and dance on the Berlin Wall. And would you say that Obama was the right man for this period in the Middle East?
Well, it is an interesting,
how would McCain have handled it?
It's interesting to ask how McCain would have handled it, how Bush 43 would have handled it. And you had seen this split even within the Republican Party while this was going on. The CPAC convention was happening just as the last moments of the Egyptian revolution were happening. And Egypt was not their #1 subject. But when it did come up, there was a divide between the Bush 43 Freedom Agenda folks, who basically said, you have to get out behind the protesters, which I suspect would have been President Bush 43's instinct to go do. And another group who were sort of the more traditional, old-line American foreign policyist, including Vice President Cheney, who came and spoke to the group and said, you have to back Mubarak no matter what. He's a great American ally, been important in the war against terror, and so forth. And so you saw this fracturing happen even within the Republican Party, and it wasn't a small fracture. They were on completely other sides of this divide, which I found to be totally fascinating. I think that Bush 41 would have hung back longer than President Obama did. And I suspect, and I could be completely wrong here, that Bush 43 instinct would have been not to hang back, having gone out and given his second inaugural address about freedom revolutions around the world. But what we also learned about Bush 43 was the disconnect between the stated policy and the way American interests worked out got pretty big at moments, and that might have trumped.
So I think we've just, had a tremendous stroke of good luck to be able to listen to these two very wise individuals share their thoughts. So will you please join me in thanking them all? Thank you very much. All right. Thank you.